Hi, this is Matt at LSAT Lab. Today's lesson is on most supported questions in the logical reasoning section. In today's lesson, we need to cover how to spot one of these questions, what the process is for approaching them, and then what are the reasoning structures that you can expect to encounter, and what kinds of trap answers you should be on the lookout for when you're down to two answer choices. In the world of logical reasoning, 24% of all questions belong to the inference family, of which most supported questions are a member. Now, 8% of all logical reasoning questions are most supported questions. So it's a major question type, it'll have a fairly big impact on your score, and it's an important one to master. So let's dive in. So the way you spot a most supported question is in the question stem itself, and you're looking for language that suggests that the answer choice is being supported by the statements above, so that the statements support the answer choice. And that's how these questions get their name. We're looking for the answer choice that is most strongly supported by the statements above. Or potentially, the information above provides the most support for which one of the following. Or which one of the following can be most reasonably inferred from the historian's statements. Now, the word inference or inferred can be tricky because if they're asking you for what can be inferred, they're asking you for what must be true. But if they're asking you for what can be most reasonably inferred, that's a most supported question. And so the big difference between a most supported question and a must be true question is the degree of certainty that you have over the answer choice. If the question is asking you for what absolutely positively has to be true, it's a must be true question. But if the question is asking you for something that is supported by the statements but doesn't necessarily have to be true, then it's a most supported question. And so what that means is that when you're working on a most supported question, it would be dangerous to take the mentality that you have on a must be true question, which is that you're looking for an answer choice that you can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt. Because there will be times on most supported questions where you'll have to choose an answer that you cannot prove based off the statements above. And so it'd be tempting to maybe want to get rid of it because you're like, well, it doesn't have to be true. But this question type is not asking you for what has to be true. It's asking you for what is most supported by the information. And so that degree of certainty that you have over the answer choice will be a little bit less as you're working on a most supported question compared to a must be true question. The process for approaching a most supported question is the same as it is for anything within the inference family, which is to first find related statements within the information above, then to look for language cues within those statements that suggest what kind of reasoning you're looking at, use that to see how those pieces connect and anticipate what an answer might sound like, and then review the answer choices. The most common reasoning structure on most supported questions is that of a comparison. So these are arguments or statements where they're giving you some information that relates two sets together. Maybe they're comparing two medications, medication X and medication Y, and maybe they talk about the effectiveness and they say that medication X is more effective than medication Y. But the statements will relate two ideas in a comparative way. Generally speaking, that works either by comparing two different things at a point in time, like medication X and medication Y, or one thing over two time periods. Maybe it's the population of city X today versus the population of city X 10 years ago. And so if you see these kinds of comparative ideas, you might be able to work through those comparisons in order to arrive at some kind of an inference. So here's a question. Go ahead and give this one a try on your own. And when you think you've got an answer that you like, go ahead and hit play again, and we'll break this one down together. All right, welcome back. So in the first sentence, they tell us that when a threat to life is common, as are automobile and industrial accidents, only unusual instances tend to be prominently reported by the news media. So they're telling us that for common threats, they are typically not very often reported in the media. And then the next sentence says that instances of rare threats, such as product tampering, however, are seen as news by reporters and are universally reported in featured stories. So common threats are rarely reported, but rare threats seem to be universally reported. And then they tell us that people in general tend to estimate the risk of various threats by how frequently those threats come to their attention. So we're assuming that coming to attention somehow, if things are being reported about in the media, that could provide one avenue for which it to come to your attention. Based off of this, people who are watching media are probably going to think that those rare threats are a bigger concern than they really are, or that common threats are less of a concern than they really are. that there's this mismatch between people's perception and reality. And that's based off of the media reports. So, and the frequency with which those threats are presented within the media. So the question stem is asking us to find what is most strongly supported on the basis of these statements. And we've already got a good idea of what that might be. That rare threats are overestimated by people who are watching media, and common threats are underestimated by people who are watching media. Either one of those, or somehow something connected to those two ideas, those would be good anticipations, although they don't have to be exactly what the right answer says. So if we look at answer choice A, it says that whether governmental action will be taken to lessen a common risk depends primarily on the prominence given to the risk by the news media. So answer choice A does include something about what the news media is doing, but it's also about what governmental action. And there's nothing in these statements that suggests anything about governmental action. So we can simply dismiss A as being out of scope. If we look at answer choice B, people tend to magnify the risk of a threat if the threat seems particularly dreadful, or if those who would be affected have no control over it. So magnifying the risk, they talk about magnifying the risk or perceiving the risk to be magnified when it's being presented to them in the media, but that's not the same thing as it being particularly dreadful, which was never discussed in the statements. Or if those who would be affected have no control over it. Again, having control over it was never discussed in the statements. So B is linking these ideas that can't be connected based off of the statements based off of the statements. So B is building an unsupported relationship. While part of that relationship is discussed, the other parts simply aren't discussed. So if you wanted to call that out of scope, that's fine as well. If you look at answer choice C, those who get their information primarily from the news media tend to overestimate the risk of uncommon threats relative to the risk of common threats. So they're overestimating the uncommon or the rare ones, which are those that are reported. This is very close to what we anticipated. Let's hold on to answer choice C and see what we get in D and E. Answer choice D says that reporters tend not to seek out information about long-range future threats, but to concentrate their attention on the immediate past and future. So this is talking about long-range versus immediate. Those issues were never discussed inside of the statements. D is building this comparison that's never discussed, so we can simply call it an unsupported comparison. Answer choice E, the resources that are spent on avoiding product tampering. Wait a minute. They never talked about resources being spent on avoiding product tampering. So this is simply out of scope. There's no need to go further with E, and that allows us to choose answer choice C with confidence. So there's our first example. Let's go look at another example with a different reasoning structure. And let's talk about one with causation. So causation is the next most common reasoning structure on most supported questions. 37% of all most supported questions contain some element of causal reasoning. And here's an example of one. And go ahead and give this one a try on your own. See if you can find an answer that you like. And when you're ready to work it through together, hit play again. All right, so what do we know? We know that an aerobics instructor this aerobics instructor is saying that compared to many forms of exercise, kickboxing aerobics is highly risky. So here's a comparison. Even though we jumped into this question expecting causation, we're presented at the very beginning with a comparative structure. So it's very common for questions to have more than one reasoning structure. And you want to use the reasoning structures to help you better perceive the gap, but you don't want to think of them as completely operating within isolation. And that many questions will contain overlapping reasoning structures within the same set of information. So we have this comparison between kickboxing aerobics and other forms of exercise, and they're saying that it's highly risky compared to those other forms of exercise. If we look at the second sentence, it says that overextending when kicking often leads to hip, knee, or lower back injuries. And the key words there are leads to, because leads to are language cues that suggest causation. So we're getting a sense of causation in the second statement, and they're saying that overextending causes injuries. So we can represent that with a causal arrow that overextending causes injuries. If we look at the last sentence, it says that such overextension is very likely to occur when beginners try to match the high kicks of more skilled practitioners. So that when beginners try to match the high kicks of skilled practitioners, that's when they overextend, essentially saying that matching those skilled practitioners causes them to overextend. And so now we've got these two causal relationships, and what we're looking for is how they connect. If we look at the two statements, we can see that overextending is contained within both, And we should be able to link these two statements together in order to build a longer causal chain. If we reorganize the two statements, take the second one and put it on top, and the top one and put it on the bottom, it's a little easier to see. So matching the high kicks of a skilled practitioner causes these beginners to overextend. And when they overextend, that causes injuries. And so we could say that matching the skilled practitioner or matching the high kicks of a skilled practitioner causes injuries for beginners. The question stem is asking us for what is most strongly supported by the aerobics instructor's statements. We've already got an idea of what we're looking for. We're looking for maybe something that extends or describes the entirety of this causal chain. Let's look at the answer choices. Answer choice A says that skilled practitioners of kickboxing aerobics are unlikely to experience injuries from overextending while kicking. Well, we know that the beginners, when they try to match the high kicks of skilled practitioners, that they can be injured. But does that mean that those who are skilled practitioners will not be injured? This is simply negating the relationship throughout the causal chain. So let's get rid of it. Answer choice B says that to reduce the risk of injuries, beginners at kickboxing aerobics should avoid trying to match the high kicks of more skilled practitioners. So this is suggesting that by avoiding trying to match the high kicks of more skilled practitioners, beginners can reduce their risk. In a way, that's essentially saying that their risk goes up when they do try to match the high kicks, which is what the causal chain suggests, that matching the high kicks of skilled practitioners can cause injuries, will increase your likelihood of injuries. So B seems to describe the causal relationship. Let's hold on to it just in case we find something better. Answer choice C says that beginners at kickboxing aerobics will not experience injuries if they avoid trying to match the high kicks of more skilled practitioners. This also looks pretty decent, but there's something about it that's pretty strong. If you look at answer choices B and C, B is basically saying in a weird way that if you avoid something that causes something else, well, your likelihood of that something else is lower. Whereas C is suggesting that if they avoid that thing that causes something else, they won't experience that something else. The degree involved in C is much stronger than the degree involved in B, even though they're fairly similar answer choices. And that strength is actually going to get answer choice C in trouble. So it's simply too strong. Answer choice D says that kickboxing aerobics is more risky than forms of aerobic exercise that do not involve high kicks. Now, we're told in the first statement that compared to many forms of exercise, kickboxing aerobics is highly risky. The thing to notice about that statement is the word many, though, because many is simply some. It could be 2, it could be 3, it could be 4. We don't really know how many is many in this case. So there are forms of aerobic exercise that are less risky than kickboxing aerobics. But answer choice D is comparing kickboxing aerobics with other forms of aerobic exercise that do not involve high kicks. And we don't know that the ones that do not involve high kicks are the same ones that are being discussed within the statements. So the comparison that's made in D is simply unsupported by the original statements. Answer choice E says that most beginners at kickboxing aerobics experience injuries from trying to match the high kicks of more skilled practitioners. And while this can happen, do we know that most beginners experience these injuries? The degree in E is getting it in trouble, and it's simply too strong to reflect the statements that were provided in the stimulus. So that lets us choose answer choice B with confidence. And while there are several good-looking wrong answers here, each one of those is wrong for a slightly different reason. Some of them are too strong, some of them are negating relationships, and some are making comparisons that can't quite be supported by the statements that were originally made. So now let's look at an example of conditional logic on most supported questions. Now, conditional logic is only present in about 29% of most supported questions. It's a major player on must be true questions, but less so on most supported questions. But there will still be many questions, a little less than 30% of most supported questions that contain conditional relationships where notation will be super helpful to help you figure out what can be inferred from the original ideas. So another example, go ahead and try this one on your own when you're ready to discuss. Go ahead and hit play again and we'll work through together. All right, welcome back. So they tell us in the first statement that early urban societies could not have been maintained without large-scale farming nearby, so that urban societies need large-scale farming nearby. And we can represent that in an if-then relationship. If a society is urban, then it needs large-scale nearby farming. So the second statement tells us this is because other methods of food acquisition, such as foraging, cannot support populations as dense as urban ones. And the important words there are this is because. So this is because is telling us that the second sentence here is telling us why that first sentence is true. And on inference questions, we don't really care why something is the case. We just care that it is true. So this is simply fluff that's kind of trying to distract you from the key ideas and from helping you see how the key ideas connect together. Let's pass over this one and jump to the next statement, that large-scale farming requires irrigation. So now we can see the connection back to the first statement because this one's also talking about large-scale farming. And they're saying that it requires irrigation. Requires tells us that irrigation is necessary to large-scale farming, and so we can represent that with an if-then relationship. If you have large-scale farming, then it needs to have irrigation. The last statement is that irrigation, which remained unfeasible in areas far from rivers or lakes until more recent times. So if irrigation remained unfeasible in areas far from rivers or lakes, so if you weren't near a river or a lake, you weren't going to have irrigation. So if you're far from rivers, no irrigation. And we can start to see how this thing is going to piece together. We've got a couple of places where these relationships connect together. If we look at the first two statements, we can see that large-scale farming connects through. And if we look at the second and third statements, we can see that irrigation is connected in both. Anytime you have the same term on opposite sides of conditional relationships, you'll be able to link them together. And anytime you have the opposite term on the same side, as with irrigation here, then you'll be able to link them together after you get done taking the contrapositive of one of the two statements. Since the first and second statements already link together so nicely, let's go ahead and leave them alone and take the contrapositive of the third statement so that we can connect it back to the first two statements. So if you have irrigation, then you're not far from rivers. So now we can see how these three ideas can connect. Urban societies require large-scale farming. Large-scale farming requires irrigation, and irrigation requires that you're not far from rivers. So we can make that inference of the three statements or the contrapositive of those. If you are far from rivers, then you're not going to be able to have an urban society. And we can either be looking for one of those ideas in the answer choices, or we could be looking for like a more constrained inference. The right answer could simply either restate one of the original ideas as it was. There's no need to go beyond it. Or it could connect either the first and second premise and come up with something like, if it's an urban society, then it needs irrigation. Or it could connect the second and third statements. And so it says something like, if it has large-scale farming, then it's not far from rivers. It's going to be some combination of those original three statements. And while we have an idea of what it might be, we don't necessarily know what it's going to be. As we look at the answer choices, answer choice A says that most peoples who lived in early times lived in areas near rivers or lakes. Well, we don't really know whether those peoples lived in urban areas or rural areas. So it's really hard to say where they lived. And that they were near rivers or lakes. That's simply unsupported by the original information. Answer choice B says, only if farming is possible in the absence of irrigation can societies be maintained in areas far from rivers or lakes. Well, this has got a couple of issues with it. Notice, first, we're talking about farming. We're not talking about large-scale farming. We're just talking about farming in answer choice B. So the scope of answer choice B is much broader than that which is being described in the original statements. And second, they're not really talking about urban societies. They're talking about all societies in answer choice B. So on two critical points, they allow the key term to shift. And instead of talking about large-scale farming, they're just talking about farming in general. Instead of just talking about urban societies, they're talking about all societies. And in those two areas, they're allowing that key term to come up slightly differently than it was presented in the statements. So there's a term shift happening in answer choice B, or a couple of them. Answer choice C says that in early times, it was not possible to maintain urban societies in areas far from rivers or lakes. So urban societies could not be far from rivers or lakes. That looks very much like what we initially anticipated. If an urban society, then it's not far from a river. Let's hold on to answer choice C in case we get another answer choice that looks also really close, and then we can compare them if needed. Answer choice D says that urban societies with farms near rivers or lakes do not have to rely upon irrigation to meet their farming needs. Urban societies do not have to rely upon irrigation just because they're near rivers or lakes? Well, according to the first two statements, urban societies need large-scale farming, and large-scale farming needs irrigation. So urban societies do need irrigation. Answer choice D directly contradicts the inference of the first and second statements. Let's get rid of it. Answer choice E says that early rural societies relied more on foraging than on agriculture for food. So this is coming back to that second sentence that we said was the evidence for why that first statement was true. They don't really tell us much about rural societies anywhere in this in these original ideas. So to say that they relied more on foraging than on agriculture doesn't really hold up. That kind of a comparison can't be supported by the original statements. We're going to call this an unsupported comparison. And so now we can choose answer choice C with confidence. Let's use our previous experience now so far with most supported questions and think about the kinds of trap answers that are likely to show up when you're working on a most supported question. So trap answers are a way of thinking about the answer choices such that you can zoom in on the right answer by eliminating the wrong ones. When you get down to two answer choices and you're torn and you're tempted between the two, it's typically because you're looking at the right answer and another answer choice that's very close but not quite right. And if you could start to think about what are some of the common traps that are common to this particular question type, you can use that to inform your decision about how to make that last elimination. So that instead of looking to try to justify one of the two choices as being the right answer, it's faster and way more accurate to try to identify a known issue within one of those two remaining choices, such that you could eliminate it and choose the other one. Now, the reason why answer choices are wrong generally falls within three buckets: issues relating to scope, issues relating to logic, and issues relating to degree. Answer choices that are never discussed or bring up issues that were never discussed are simply out of scope. And 21% of wrong answers on most supported questions are simply wrong because they're talking about something that was never discussed within the original set of ideas. With regard to logic, answer choices that are unsupported are ones that bring in terms that were originally there, but they present them in a slightly different way. Typically, that's through changing the reasoning structure, either going from conditional to comparison or causation, but by changing the relationship, even though the terms themselves are the right terms to be discussing. Answer choices that contradict the original set of ideas might be tempting a little bit because they're very relevant. The terms are there, but the way they're being presented is the opposite of what was being stated initially. Negations and reversals, ones that take the relationship, use the right reasoning structure, but go backwards or get it wrong. 7% of all wrong answers on most supported questions are simply negating or possibly reversing that relationship. And then issues of degree, so answer choices that are too strong to be justified by the original set of ideas. And that's actually the most common reason why an answer choice is wrong. So if you're down to a couple choices or down to two, and you're trying to find, which one is the wrong answer, it's not a bad idea to think about, is either one of these being stated in a way that is stronger than I can justify based off of the statements originally. So remember, the key language when you're working on identifying a most supported question is most strongly supported or most reasonably inferred, or the statements provide the strongest support for. The reasoning structures, comparisons is the most common one at 58%, causation at 37%, and conditional logic at 29%. And then trap answers to be on the lookout for: answer choices that are too strong, answer choices that are out of scope, unsupported, taking the right terms but relating them in the wrong way, contradiction, and negation. So that's it for most supported questions. I invite you to check out some of these other lessons or visit us today at lsatlab.com.